Welcome back to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm Mickey Huff with Eleanor Goldfield. In this segment, Eleanor and I are going to talk a little bit more about current events and applying the critical media literacy lens to them. Eleanor, it's always a pleasure to catch up with you and talk about things going on in our crazy world. Of course, the assassination attempt against Donald Trump happened not long ago in Butler, Pennsylvania, in the Rust Belt, not far from where I grew up. So I imagine we might have a little chat about some of the media coverage around that. It's also the RNC convention here. We're talking on July 18th. The program, of course, airs the following week, but no shortage of things to talk about. However, you particularly wanted to talk about this story that came from the conservative, we'll say, to be generous, Washington Examiner. There was a recent piece called Media Ripped for Falsely Claiming Biden Deported More Than Trump. This is a story that came out about a week ago now. And it'll tell us about this story. This is a former U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement chief condemned a wire service report this week that claimed that Joe Biden recently deported more illegal immigrants than Donald Trump. And of course, immigration is a big issue in the campaign, particularly among the GOP. There's a lot of dog whistle politics that go on with any of these talks about immigration. What we're seeing at the convention is a lot of talk about unity and so forth, while we simultaneously see people holding placards and signs that, of course, are nothing close to what unity looks like. And a lot of them are very, very hostile and negative towards immigrants, and particularly certain kinds of immigrants. But Eleanor Goldfield, please tell us about this issue in this piece, because I know you've been thinking a lot about it.
Yeah, thanks, Mickey. And just to your point, certain kinds of immigrants. I mean, I'm the child of immigrants, right? And my mom didn't move here till 1980 something. But of course, she's blonde. And so she's white and blonde. So it's not that kind of immigrant, right? And so what I want to cover here is it was actually a Reuters report that the Washington Examiner then decided to put in its crosshairs that is titled "Biden is now deporting more people than Trump." And it uses quotes from both Biden and Trump. Trump, the usual anti-immigrant drivel, but then Biden also, a quote from him is, quote, "Today I'm announcing actions to bar migrants who cross our southern border unlawfully from receiving asylum." And this is something that Natasha Leonard over The Intercept covered early in June, I believe, about the Democrats' legacy of policing the southern border, which actually started with Clinton. After he pushed through NAFTA, he made sure it was the first time that the U.S.-Mexico border was actually militarized. So the Democrats have a rich history of this kind of anti-Southern immigration legislation. And so it's not really cause for surprise. It's obviously cause for concern. But just to set the context there with that understanding, what happens in this Washington Examiner article is something that is prime fodder for Project Censored and the work that we do, because there's this person who's a former ICE chief of staff, John Fear. And yes, his last name is Fear, though spelled differently. He says that and he now works, the revolving door has pushed him to a think tank called the Center for Immigration Studies, which opposes, quote unquote, illegal immigration. And he says that you have to look at the difference between a removal conducted by ICE and a return conducted by U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP. So he's making a distinction between people getting like their doors knocked on by ICE and being removed as in they were already here, and then a return, which he says is different because they haven't been processed through the American immigration system. Now, there is, of course, an administrative distinction here, but that administrative distinction is the US's alone. It is not a distinction that is realized in the lived experiences of people who end up in cages, who end up deported, who end up dead in the deserts between Mexico and the United States. So this is one of those examples of, I don't know if Project Censored has a word for it, but a way of trying to create distinction where there isn't one, a way of trying to fool the reader or the viewer into thinking, oh, well, this policy is actually nicer because it's a return. You know, return sounds nice, doesn't it? Oh, you're returning somewhere, even though these people aren't from Mexico most of the time. So it's a way to try and bend reality to suit the their own means in this way, to try and make it look like Biden is not actually doing enough at the border and he's letting too many people in. So Trump's the better one because he's actually deported more people. So it's also a race to the bottom, like who can be the worst human being and who can deport more people and put more people in cages, rip families apart, et cetera, Mickey.
Or which president can bury more children under rubble with US made bombs. I mean, again, it is a race to the bottom, and the rhetoric that that's coming out of, say, right now, of course, the convention is going on. The show is pre-recorded. Again, I repeat that because when people listen to this next week, sometimes people will shake their fist at the broadcast, acting as if we're missing something that's happening next week. Rest assured, something strange will happen next week when this show airs, and we'll talk about that later. But it is good. And again, how many people read fact checking? And of course, there's issues with fact checking. Not all fact checking is equal, but it is good at least to have some sort of record or a tally of how many statements are being made at such convention, which is prime time aired, right? Getting some considerable viewership and so on, particularly after what happened this last weekend in Butler, Pennsylvania, with the Trump campaign. The Poynter Institute, PolitiFact, not the worst of the fact-checking groups, they've actually done a pretty decent job of breaking down. And I'm bringing this up because they specifically recently looked at immigration, and they looked at the Arizona Senate candidate, Carrie Lake, their claims talking about how that the U.S. representative from Arizona, Ruben Gallego, voted to let millions of people pour into the country and illegally cast ballots. I mean, again, these are false statements, right? These are things that are not happening. Steve Scalise in Louisiana said on the border, Biden and Harris opened it up to the entire world and prisons were being emptied. The idea that the border is open is just categorically false. I understand that it's useful rhetorically and politically to use that kind of language, but as you know, Eleanor, the borders are pretty heavily policed. In fact, we know that the borders, as you were mentioning earlier about which kinds of immigrants, some borders seem to be far more policed and walled than others. And that's by design, right? And so, but again, I think back to the media literacy angle, and I'd like to have, you talk a little bit about this with some of this kind of coverage. People that are tuning into this kind of convention, depending upon if they watch Team Blue or Team Red media sources, they don't really know if Nikki Haley's claims about Kamala Harris are true. Haley acted as if it was entirely Kamala Harris's job to, quote, fix the border. But let's go back to the frame. It assumes the border is broken. It assumes that that's what the vice president is supposed to do. And by the way, I'm in California. I remember what Kamala Harris did here for immigrants and communities of color and people. And you'd think the GOP would actually be cheerleading some of the things that Harris did in California. So again, the frame of this, it's based on a series of assumptions. You mentioned this earlier. There's gross distortion of language and hyperbole to make things appear to be worse than they are. I'm not saying there aren't issues around border and people coming in and so on, but what I am saying is that there is a concerted effort to create straw person, kind of fallacies, blowing up situations so that they're easily able to be, kind of torn apart in terms of criticism against Democrats, who we'll get into later. But Eleanor Goldfield, maybe you can say a little bit more just about media coverage around this issue of immigration. And of course, the fact that in general, the establishment press seems to let political figures get away with saying nearly anything, right? And it's not such that the lying is happening to the degree to which that people are supposed to believe them all, paraphrasing Hannah Arendt. It's that when so many falsehoods are coming out, people just kind of lose the notion of what's true in the first place. They almost stop looking for it. Can you comment on some of that? Because there's a lot of that going on out of the convention. I'm sure later we'll see similar things happening in a different way from another convention in Chicago. We'll see what happens. But Eleanor, what are some of your remarks on these things?
I mean, absolutely, Mickey. And I want to just also mention to listeners that we previously had on the show John Washington, the author of the book, The Case for Open Borders, who writes a really compelling book about borders and their malleability, their movability, and indeed their militarization. And that in fact, today we have the most militarized border that we've ever had, and it still doesn't work. It doesn't work in the sense that people still find a way across because humans move. That is the only thing that has been true of us throughout history when all other things have changed, right? Humans will always find a way to move, particularly when the US is responsible via the Monroe Doctrine and other kinds of policies like that for destroying people's home countries.
Okay, so this is where I was going to interject here, and you already came in with it, as I was saying, why is it that so many people are coming here? History has clearly shown many of the places that the United States colonizes in whatever way, neoliberal way, economically, physically, bombs, destroys, etc. You know, when we saw in the 60s and 70s massive waves of people coming from Southeast Asia, what was happening there? What was happening in Southeast Asia at the time? Oh, yeah, the Vietnam War that leveled Vietnam, killed 3 million people, went into Laos, Cambodia, the surrounding region. We could go on and on. The Middle East, we've been bombing the hell out of the Middle East for 30 plus years.
And why is it that Europe is now freaking out and moving towards the right in so many ways because of immigration from the Arab world? Well, thanks, U.S. empire.
And NATO.
Right.
And the idea that there was just these big left gains in Europe. Again, let's remember, this center left is a neoliberal, more of a neoliberal kind of a coalition going on there. So a lot of hay being made about this left insurgency in Europe it doesn't stack up to all the details if you're paying attention. But nevertheless, back to that issue of immigration, creating immigrants, right? There's a push and a pull. There's no contextual discussion of in the media why there are people at the border, where they're coming from, and what's causing people to need to move out of their own homeland. So maybe talk more about some of that, Eleanor.
Yeah, and it's incredible. I mean, and I mentioned NAFTA earlier. That caused a huge wave. The North American Free Trade Agreement is what that stands for. And this has been a horrific trade agreement that crippled the ability, particularly of small, like campesinos, small scale Mexican farmers, to be able to make a living. And so where are they going to go? And of course, Clinton knew this, which is why under Clinton was the first time that the border between Mexico and the US started to be militarized. Because again, these people aren't dumb. They know what they're doing. They know that they're going to be ripping families apart. They know that people are going to die at the border. It's not about safety because, as James Baldwin famously said, if I'm starving, that's your problem. And so you don't make safety by oppressing other people. And that's very evident by, what we see around the world at all kinds of borders and checkpoints, whether that be in Israel or in the United States. And I think with regards to the Washington Examiner article and this lens of critical media literacy, I think it's also important to note that I think a lot of times when somebody sees a critique, particularly of corporate media, they immediately think, oh, well, if it's a critique of it, then this critique must be true. Because it all of a sudden points out to them that, oh, well, here's what they said that's wrong, and here's why here's the real answer. It's difficult to then say, well, what's the critique of the critique, right? It feels like the person who knows enough to know that that's wrong must also just have the answer, that single perfect, mathematical response that makes them right. So I think that's the other thing that critical media literacy does is opens things up to nuance so that I can say that this guy who's the former head of ICE, he obviously knows more about the admin of ICE than I do. And God bless him for that. But the lived experiences and the reality of people who are being caged, who are being thrown back, whatever you want to call that, deported, removed, returned, however that lingo is used, the lived experiences are still there. And so it's still true that people are being forcibly removed from the United States, from entering and seeking asylum in the United States under Biden. That is the bottom line here. And so I think that that is also something that this kind of watchdog journalism, that independent journalism needs to do, is expose to viewers how this is sneaky, how this is insidious. And interestingly enough, which the same man, Fear, from the former ICE official, said that media that reports anything to the contrary, basically, of what he's saying, that the Biden administration isn't doing enough at the border, further undermines the credibility of journalism. If journalism's wanted to help protect the American people against dangerous federal policies and politicians, they would be exposing the fallout of the Biden administration's agenda and pressing Biden's political appointees to defend their records, end quote. So he's basically saying, if you want to be considered a journalist to me, you are going to protect my agenda. But of course, Mickey, we know that real journalists don't protect any politician's agenda. That's not our job. Our job is to dig for the truth and hold politicians of all stripes accountable for the kind of policies that they're pushing.
Yeah, absolutely. Watchdog journalism is, again, it's a mainstay of just muckraking reporting. I mean, that's what's at the root of it, is to hold people in power accountable to the public by informing the public of what's actually going on. As George Selby said in the mid-20th century, the job of journalism isn't to be objective and do both sidesing. It's to tell the public what's actually going on, to tell people how are the powerful fleecing the public. You go back 100 years ago, and Lincoln Steffens in the Shame of the City series, went to many major towns, cities in the United States, and looked at what he called an unholy alliance between political figures and prominent business people. I mean, 100 years later, dark money is basically the whole name of the game. Peter Thiel behind J.D. Vance. I mean, this is basically the really hard right, more libertarian, very anti-immigrant, very right-wing and reactionary. That's the money that's behind Trump. Elon Musk, $45 million a month pledged, right? The tech bro money is pouring in to the RNC coffers. And again, one of the things that attracts those people is the bravado. Again, and it's the idiocy, which you've already pointed out factually, and let the facts speak for themselves. The Biden administration hasn't been friendly at the border. They're not friendly around immigration policies. They have a very neoliberal approach. And again, as an historian, I have to say, pointing out Bill Clinton and pointing out how this stuff really started to shift into a more neoliberal world in the 1990s was in the Rust Belt, right? Where this J.D. Vance person writes the hillbilly elegy. I mean, talk about a con man grifter, throwing his own folks under the bus, going to Yale and all. I mean, a pseudo-intellectual, quote, memoir, if ever there was, hillbilly elegy, but save that for another time. People might want to read that. But this idea, that they just concoct this up, that all these people are coming for their jobs and so on. I mean, it's just sheer rubbish, and Clinton was able to sell it. And I watched him do it because I grew up in the Rust Belt. I saw them come in and campaign around all of this stuff. I saw them say how no jobs would be lost. And what did they do? They brought in private prisons for people from the mills to go work. So they filled those up with nonviolent drug offenders, right? I mean, again, all of this bait and switch, all of this shell game stuff came then. And then after people in the Midwest saw that the billionaire Ross Perot from Texas called it'll be a giant sucking sound of jobs leaving the country. Well, the billionaires are often right about some things, and that's usually about the bottom line, money, these kind of things. He was right. It was a boon to some corporations, but terrible for workers. And that resentment, right, that comes out of the collapse of the Rust and the creation of the Rust Belt in the 1970s and the 1980s was ripe to have people desperate for Clinton in the 1990s, where they were, he was selling them this bill of goods. it just paved the way for Bush's compassionate conservatism. It just kind of continued the policy. But by the way, even Bush's immigration policy, you'd have to wonder if the current GOP would have to say about that, right? Because Bush openly said, well, we actually need immigrant labor to do cheap things, right? Bush actually said that stuff out loud, George W. Bush. But things have shifted so far to the right in the last 30 years that we're really left with the Biden administration and the Democrats pretending that they have some humanitarian immigration policy, which it really is not. And then, of course, the GOP, which, you go take a look at Project 2025. They want to incarcerate 100,000 immigrants like right away. They want to begin deportations, incarcerations. Again, I think people need to really pay a closer attention, and the kind of spectacle that we're seeing at the convention in Milwaukee right now with the Republicans. Again, it's thin on facts and high on rhetoric and high on sort of the red meat to the lions thing about trying to build the base and pump people up, which I think is frankly very, very dangerous. And the media should be doing a better job of dissecting those messages, historically contextualizing them, as you were just doing. But again, that's what the critical media literacy lens does. It doesn't pick a side or a party. It looks at the issues, looks at the facts, looks at the history, and tries to help the public understand what's actually happening. Eleanor.
Yeah, absolutely, Mickey. And to your point about the ramping up, I mean, Project 2025 is really just like the yes anding. I mean, I feel like it's a very terrible improv class that we're living through in the US right now. It's just a continuous yes anding. Okay, yes, more money to the military. Yes, more money for militarizing the border. Yes, more money for ecocide. And so it's just like this continuous yes anding, regardless of which side of the aisle you're looking at it from. And so I think that's the other important thing to note here. And lest we forget Obama was nicknamed the deporter in chief. I mean, there's a reason for that, right? And these Biden policies, they get and I think it was in early June when the Biden administration pointed out that they announced that they were going to basically disallow asylum seekers at the border. Biden tweeted something, or his lackeys tweeted something to the effect of, well, there's one thing I won't do, and that's split up families. Well, here's the thing, Joe. Again, the lived experience, you can say that, but or his people know, that actually is what's going to happen. Because, for instance, what happens at the border is that asylum seekers can't go in, but unaccompanied children can still get in. Now, this is where it gets really sick, because, of course, what does unaccompanied mean? It means that you just shove your child towards the border and say, I need you to make it because I might not. Is that not splitting up families? As a parent, I cannot imagine saying goodbye to my child at the border and having that be considered a more compassionate policy than what was under Trump, or what would be under Trump. I mean, it's absolute drivel. And that's the other important thing, is that the Republicans are a lot better at saying things just like flat out, like, hey, we're going to do this and it's inhumane and we're down with it. The Democrats say things like, we're not going to split up families, but they're well aware of what their policies do. They're well aware of how these actually affect people on the ground at the border. And so it's really important not just to have that critical media lens when looking at how journalists portray things, or how the stenographers to the State Department portray things, but just looking at how the politicians themselves talk about these things and say, okay, well, you say you're not going to do that, but let's see what your policy actually does.
Yeah, we will certainly see. And again, I know that, Eleanor, that you and I will have more to say about the convention coverage in particular. And I know, of course, we'll have more to say coming up later in the summer. We're not prognosticators. We don't know what's going to happen. Things are looking more and more 1968 by the day. Time will tell. Anything else you want to add here in this segment, Eleanor? It's always good to talk about some of the latest things and apply critical media lens to things that are happening, and also not just to critique the establishment press and so on, but to highlight independent reporting and the muckraking type journalism that the independent press is known for, and to remind the public why we really need it.
Yeah, absolutely, Mickey. And I'd say that projectcensored.org has great resources, whether that be alternative news sites or or just, you know, how to continuously critique the media that you take in. And again, that isn't just the media that is journalists. That is the media that is really anything that you see, read, or listen to. I would recommend that folks also check out. And I had a person who works on this, Dr. Austin Coker, on the show recently. He has a transactional records access clearinghouse, which is basically through FOIA requests and a lot of other things. It is a one-stop shop for immigration data, which they don't want you to have. That's why it's behind a FOIA request, lots of them, in fact. And it's at trac.syr.edu. It's a project out of Syracuse University that basically gets all this information from the government, which should be public information and easy to access, and shows you the reality of the situation statistically, and then also shares information on the ground. So I'd recommend that people check out that. That is a great place to look for this. And then again, you know, the goal of Project Censored is to expand your media diet, not constrict it. So I'm not going to tell you only get your immigration information from this one place. If you want to read the Washington Examiner, that's fine. Yeah, we all need a laugh. But I think it's important to make sure that we read a lot of different places and, again, recognize who they're talking to. They just spoke to one former ICE official who now works for an anti-immigration think tank. They spoke to that one person for this article. So it's like, okay, but what about anybody over it? No? Okay. So again, really checking out who they're talking to and the angles and the biases that those outlets have as a whole is super important.
Absolutely. The frames that they use, the language they employ, the terms they avoid. Many things go into crafting. Well, let's just call it what it often is, propaganda. And a lot of effort goes into making the propaganda appear to be journalistic, right? But of course, you know, many of them, the Team Red, Team Blue corporate networks, cable networks, they've kind of even just done away with the pretense that they're actually committing acts of journalism many of the times, and they're just sort of either platforming nonsense and he said, she said, or they're just going for one particular bias. It's a classic thing too with a lot of these think tanks and these fancy sounding places with banal patriotic names and so on, right? Right, like the Heritage Foundation, right? Project 2025,
The Atlantic Council.
yeah, they're never, yeah, totally. They're counseling around the Atlantic, yes. But it's never really explained who funds them, what they are, what their ideological proclivities are, what their agendas are, right? Historically, one of my favorites was the Heartland Institute, right? Which was actually started by the fossil fuel industry as a propaganda arm to pay quote unquote scientists 10 grand per article to try to debunk or cast doubt on global warming issues. And of course, that's another right-wing coup, is they got us away from saying climate, right? The climate, global warming, and into climate change, right? The banal climate change, right? And it's not a climate change, it's a crisis, right? So again, we have to be very mindful. This is what critical media literacy education does. It helps us decode propaganda. It helps us understand biases. And you're right, we need to diversify our sources of information. We need to read things like the Washington Examiner, even for the reasons you put forward. We need to read things across the spectrum. So again, we've got a lot of independent sources and things listed at projectcensored.org for free. And of course, we're always open and welcome to hear from you all, our listeners and viewers, the things that you think, things that you're checking out. So Eleanor, I think we're probably about out of time in this segment. Is that right?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, as always, it is a delight to sit down and speak with you about these things, and I'm sure we'll do it again next month. I am Mickey Huff, and you are
Eleanor Goldfield. Thanks so much, y'all, for tuning into the Project Censored radio show. We will talk to you next time.